Welcome to the Driving Change podcast on the Evergreen Podcast Network, where we live at the intersection of neuroscience and storytelling. If you love great stories and you love understanding the mindset it takes to be a world-class change agent, then join us as our fascinating guests from all walks of life unpack their unique journeys of perseverance and passion, of expertise and experience, and be inspired to use your own story to drive change. Welcome back to another episode of the Driving Change podcast. I'm your host, Jeff Bloomfield. And as always, I'm thrilled you're joining us for another deep dive into the minds and stories of the world's most fascinating change makers. So today, before we jump in, a quick shout out to our season sponsor, Brain Trust, where neuroscience meets storytelling to transform how the world communicates. You can learn more of their work at braintrustgrowth.com. Now, today's guest, you better buckle up. Buckle up, Buttercup, as they say. We got a guy who's not just been through the fire, he's basically reassembled himself from the ashes, quite literally. He's been named one of the top 30 global leadership gurus 5 different times. That's an impressive 1 time, 5 times. He's addressed the United Nations, the U.S. Department of State, World Management Forum in Iran, and even the U.S. Air Force. His books are bestsellers. His podcast, ranked number 1 for Fortune 500 executives. I had the privilege of being on there a couple seasons ago. His clients span from business titans to government officials. And his story that we're going to get into, it includes even falling off a mountain. And I'm not even going to give you any more details on that. You got to stay tuned to hear this part of the story. But don't let his grit fool you. This guy is just as much about heart as he is about hustle. His life's work is dedicated to helping leaders uncover their emotional source code. This is kind of his proprietary way of thinking about source code around your purpose. And I can't wait for him to unpack that for you as well. This whole internal operating system that drives behavior, builds loyalty, and ultimately creates meaning in life and business. This is an exciting episode for us because this guy's been coaching folks around the world. And whether you're a stay-home parent coaching a little league team or leading a Fortune 50 company, I think you're going to get a lot out of today's show. So Dov Baron, guru to leadership experts around the world, welcome to the Driving Change podcast.
Thank you, sir. It's a pleasure and honor to be here. And I now have to live up to that bloody introduction.
I'm raising the bar, brother. No, you're going to live up to it.
I'm like, whoa, who's that dude? He's impressive.
Right? Yeah. Isn't it funny though? Sometimes we don't, until you hear somebody else introduce you, you don't realize how far your journey has actually taken you.
Well, I think that's part of how we are designed. I mean, first of all, more than 70% of very successful people have imposter syndrome, right? That's an important thing to understand. So if you are in your position right now thinking, oh my God, I'm an imposter, just look around. So is everybody else. They're all feeling like that. And I love imposter syndrome. I know I had it for years and years and hold on to it for one simple reason. It's made me better. Because I'm not willing to be caught out as being the imposter. So I learn and I keep growing and keep developing. Imposter syndrome is a great blessing. So when I hear that introduction, it's like, okay, I got to raise my game. That's good. It's excellent.
And the 30% of people who didn't report they had imposter syndrome probably reported the low self-awareness, right?
Either that or they're just freaking liars. As John Bradshaw said, 97% of all families are dysfunctional and the other 3% are liars.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Let's start where I like to start with all of our guests, and that's really letting the audience get to know you. So let's go back and let's unpack your origin story. Take us back as far as you can. Go back to little Dov growing up and your journey through. Who were those influences in your life? What was your life story? What did it look like? I'll ask questions and interject as I go.
Of course.
Because I think that rear view mirror look will really give us insight into who you become today. So when we get to your expertise, we'll actually believe you.
Thank you. It's a long and in-depth story, but I'll give you the Reader's Digest of it. And that is, I was born in Northern England in abject poverty. I was surrounded by crime and violence and addiction and abuse and all kinds of horrible shit, to put it into a simple term. And certainly didn't fit in my environment. Even as a child, knew there was something off. My mom shipped me off to the rabbis to study with them when I was just like 7 or 8 years old, because I was just this weird kid who talked about weird things. And I started studying early Kabbalah as that little kid. By the time I was 10, I was studying prana yoga by myself, taught myself prana yoga, and became very interested in politics and psychology, even as a kid. Then at what was I, 14 or 15, started my own business, my first business. At 16, got married, took my mother to court so I could win the case, because you need parental sign off on that, and she wouldn't give it. So I took her to court and I won the case. The judge was the same judge who put my dad and my stepdad and my grandfather all in jail. And he was famously tough, and he listened to what I had to say, and he said, "You're the most intelligent, articulate 16-year-old I've ever met. And if you're stupid enough to get married at this age, here's my stamp."
Have at it.
Right. And I used to say to my mom years later, like, why didn't you just say yes? I was just being oppositional. When you just say,
Right.
Sure, get married, right? But I was married, and I left the UK at 21 to begin my travel to study with different teachers and study businesses in different continents. I actually had businesses on 3 continents. I traveled and studied. I spent a little bit of time in Europe, and then I was in Australia for many, in Asia and Indonesia, studying and traveling, then living in Australia for many years before I moved to North America. I'm a polymath, so that means I study lots of different things and find the connections between them. So I started off with the metaphysical, with the Kabbalah, Vedanta, which is Hindu philosophy, Buddhism, the Tao, Gnostic and Coptic Christianity, put all those together and got really sort of frustrated with how many people could tell me when my chakra was spinning, but they couldn't get their shit together. And it was like, what's going on here? So I started studying psychology, became a Jungian therapist, and I loved Jungian psychology. Still running my business, still bodybuilding, still doing martial arts, doing all those other things. But it was like, this is really fascinating. Got sick of people coming in and complaining, but not doing anything. And I'd met a couple of very successful millionaires who lived in my city in Western Australia, and started asking them questions and finding out what's going on. And they introduced me to a bunch of athletes, entertainers, and highly successful individuals, and found out they were kind of soulless. Then in 83, sort of stumbled my way into quantum physics, understanding quantum physics and neuroscience, very early days of neuroscience. And then I started putting that all together, and that's how I designed my thesis around the emotional source code of what's driving individuals. And so I started advising businesses and organizations, as well as running my own, but helping them with that by putting this together, the understanding that human beings are a post-rational species. We like to think we're very logical and very rational, but we're post-rational. What does that mean? It means that we tell rational lies. We rationalize, but it's rational lies about the emotional response we had that is ahead of our conscious thinking. And so once we understand that, we go, well, what's driving that? And that's the emotional source code. That's the Reader's Digest version. I hope that wasn't too long.
All right. So I have some follow-up questions.
Good.
So what was your first business at 14?
Hairdressing. I was a freelance hairdresser. I went into, I did a 5-year apprenticeship in 10 months as a hairdresser because I wanted to be an artist, and what they used to be called career counselors, I don't know what they're called now, who came to us at 13 and said, what do you want to be? And I said, an artist. And he said, 1 in 100 make it, and 1 in 100 of those make any money, find something else. I went home and cried, like, to my mom, and my mom said, there's other ways to be artists. And I said, how? She goes, I know a guy who's a hairdresser, and he's a famous hairdresser. I was like, okay, so I can get you a little job. So I went and worked Saturdays and illegally left school and found a way out so that I could do this apprenticeship. So like I said, I did a 4-year apprenticeship in 10 months. And by the time I was 15, I was working full-time and running my own business on the side.
Wow. Okay. Second follow-up question. These are just for fun for me. I'm just peeling back the brain, because, you know, your source code, we're going to get into your own source code here as we go. But this 16-year-old bride, where is she today?
Actually, she died last week.
Are you serious?
I am serious. She died last week. My daughter at this moment is at her funeral. As we are speaking, she's at her funeral. So
Holy cow.
Chris was 6 months older than me. We met. She'd never met anybody like me because I was ambitious. Like I said, we lived in a ghetto. So there was, people didn't have ambition. They wanted a job, a union job and that kind of thing. And I was like, no, I'm going to start businesses. I'm going to travel. I'm going to be in the different parts of the world. And so I was novelty. There's nothing wrong with her. She was great. But we were kids, so she was 17 when we got married. I was 16. And we were actually married for 5 years. And people go, what broke you up? Was it because you were so young? And I'm like, absolutely not. And they go, really? Come on. And I go, no. What broke us up is the same thing that breaks up 40 people who are 40 and get married. And they go, what? I said, we were doing the same shit other people were doing. That's it. We didn't do anything different. I've been married this time for 28 years. And this time, why does people say, what's your secret? We don't do what other people do. We have a completely different model for relationship that we actually teach very high profile couples because it's a different model. If you do the old model of relationship, guess what? There's a 50% failure rate. Well, I'm not going into business with you for 50% failure rate. So why would I go into marriage with you? So unfortunately, she passed very recently. And that's very sad.
Yeah, I'm sorry to hear that. So, all right, let's pivot then off of that and talk a little bit about you're kind of this weird eclectic. I remember when I met you, I'm like, this dude is like this weird eclectic mix. Like, it's almost as if I don't know, Forrest Gump had a baby with Stephen Hawking, who had a baby with you just have such a fascinating life story and background. And clearly, your source code was written a little differently than the average bear from a DNA standpoint. And I love that because we both have a fascination with studying the brain and understanding what motivates people to behave the way they behave.
Of course.
What was the epiphany for you when you said, okay, there's something here, when you find the intersection of all of these strange behavioral religion things I've been studying, but then I came across psychology and married that with quantum physics and then neuroscience, and boom, this epiphany, this spark went off in your mind that says this source code that's written into our DNA that's unique to every individual, yet is consistent across the human population. I think there's something here. What did that moment look like? Or was it not a moment? Was it more of an evolution?
I think that we all like to look for these flash of lightning moments.
Yeah, they're sexy, right?
They're sexy, yeah. And I don't think anything works like that. I think a lot of it is retrospective. You look back and you go, oh, yeah, that goes with that. And that takes you to the next step. And I think that that's where we shoot ourselves in the foot. We're always waiting for the lightning to strike us, as opposed to understanding there's an evolution. So pause and look at that. And what for me, and this is a lot of my guidance with others, is look for the shit that bothers you. Right? Because if you want to know what an entrepreneur is, it's a person who solves problems. So look for what it is that emotionally, mentally, societally bothers you, and say, what can I do about that? And what is the solution that's offered? And is there another solution, or is there a gap? Look for that gap. And so when I was studying the metaphysical studies, the spiritual stuff, I mean, I loved it. I ate, slept, lived, breathed it, loved it. It was fantastic. But what got on my nerves and annoyed me was, you understand this, but why can't you function in the world? And then I got the psychological people who were like, they admitted they needed help. And so it was wonderful. They sit down and they start understanding themselves. But these are the half-assed personal development people who drive me nuts, because they go to try and understand themselves, but they never do anything with it. And then they say, well, I've done 10 years of therapy. No, you've not. No, you've not. You've read the books, you've sat in the office, you've talked to the coach or the therapist, but what have you actually taken on, ingrained, and said, no more? Where's that point of shift where you change the way you are? They didn't get that. And so for me, it was like, well, people, they can understand, but they don't do. That was frustrating. And then when I sort of came into neuroscience, I was like, oh, it's chemical. There's a neurochemistry happening. But is that neurochemistry fixed? I wanted to understand, was that fixed? And when I realized that it wasn't fixed and could be adjusted, and then understanding quantum fields and how I am generating a quantum field, interacting with other quantum fields, what happens then, that to me was what was fascinating. So it was a compounded effect. And it started with, because I mean, my first work in psychology, working with very high profile people, was in helping them with behavioral change. Like, how do I change this behavior? And I was magnificent at it. I could get them to change, but it never stuck. So, okay, well, what's missing? Well, you can't change it because you don't believe yet. Oh, okay, so we need belief change. So I studied NLP. I became a master practitioner of neuro-linguistic programming, and I got belief change, but it didn't stick. What is going on? And so I worked my way through to find out how the emotional source code was structured up and down, and that's what changed everything.
So this is great. I love this because one of the things you and I are aligned on is that beliefs drive behaviors, and behaviors, if repeated enough, create habits, and the results you get in your life are really from habits more than anything else. But those are obviously repetitive behaviors over time that started from a belief. And you found that through your studies and through your journey, and especially coaching people, that there's something that actually forms the belief. And if you don't go even further back to understand, I don't want to simplify it as the junk in your brain trunk, but there's something in your source code that helped form your worldview, with which aligns which kind of your beliefs emanate from, and then that's where the whole string starts.
Yeah.
That leads to some type of behavioral change. What's your thought on that piece of it? Because we know that beliefs are powerful and they're motivators, but if you don't think about where they came from and why that you believe what you believe, you'll never be willing to change a belief in order to change a habit to change a result.
Right. And that's exactly it. And thank you for putting it so clearly, Jeff. So think of it this way. I'll give you an example. We were doing back in the days when we did large group trainings. We're doing a training and there's 100 people in the room or whatever it is. It's a 5-day intensive. And I said, who's willing to be challenged? Put your hand up. Okay. Keep your hand up if you're a person of faith. Right? Okay. So there's 15 people. Just making up a number. I don't remember how it was. So okay. I said, now, you're willing to be challenged? Yes. Okay. So first thing I want you to know is I have no interest in changing your faith. I have no interest in dissuading you from your faith. So let's just start with you understanding that. Okay, good. Can I pick on you? Yes. All right, Frank. What's your faith? I'm a Catholic, he says. I said, why? Because what do you mean, why? Because I'm a Catholic. I said, no, I'm asking you why. What's the evidence that you're a Catholic? He goes, I go to church every Sunday. I do the sacrament, blah, 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 And I said, well, if I park my Ford in a Ferrari garage every Sunday, does that make it a Ferrari? He goes, no, that's stupid. And I go, oh, well, maybe you're not a Catholic then. He goes, I am. And then he's getting frustrated. And I said, okay, well, tell me why you're a Catholic. And he goes, my mom and dad are Catholic. They brought me up Catholic. I go, oh, so your parents determined what you were. So you're not a Catholic. You're just a reflection of what I am. And so we went on with this. And he was, Of course, he was pissed at me by the end, which I expected. About 2-3 months later, I'm walking down the main street in Vancouver, main shopping street, Robson Street, and I can see him like a half a block away. And I'm thinking, should I duck into the store? And just, because this is not going to be good. But now, of course, I'm not going to do that. And he comes up to me and he sees me, so lifts his head, sees me, and huge smile on his face, gives me a big hug, and he goes, Dov, it's so great to see you. And I'm like, oh, really? That's kind of a surprise. And he goes, why? I said, well, the last time I saw you, I wasn't your favorite person. And he goes, oh, no. He goes, I absolutely want to thank you. And I said, for what? And he took a pause and he smiles at me and he says, because now I'm a Catholic.
Wow. I thought you were going to say, because now I'm Protestant.
No, because now I'm a Catholic. No. Because he
went and did the digging, right? He went and did the work.
Digging to get past the conditioning. So most of our beliefs, and this is one of the things I say to people all the time, is even the most successful people you meet, most people have never made a decision. They think they've decided whether to have coffee or not have coffee. They think they've decided who to marry. They think they've decided whether they're a certain faith or who to vote for. But most of it's simply conditioning that they've never questioned. And if you can't question everything, you can't question anything. So it's like you've got to be willing to question the hardest possible truths that you hold together. Not because they're wrong, because you want to find out if they're yours. If you didn't choose it, it's not yours. Your beliefs are indoctrinated into you, not by people who are bad, but by situations and circumstances that you took on for one simple reason. When you were born into an environment, that's your emotional environment. That's your emotional source code base. Out of that, you, me, we, all of us, look at the world and we go, how do I survive? How do I survive in this environment? So we give things meaning. So above the emotional source code is the meaning I've given to that. That's why you can have a sibling born into the same family who seems to be so different because they've given it a different meaning. Why have we given it meaning? To survive the lunatic asylum called my childhood. And you go, well, I had a great childhood. Yeah, but there's things about it that just didn't work. Not because your parents were bad, but because we all have different needs. So you create meaning. Out of that meaning, we create your identity. This is the number one addiction of all human beings. Not the guy in the alley with the needle in his arm. You, me, all of us, we're addicted to our identity. And the identity is built on how do we survive based on the meaning. Out of that identity, we build beliefs and values. And those beliefs and values generate behaviors which become habits. And then we say, this is how I live. No, that's how you've been living. It's a repetitive cycle. Now, I understand that most people will never confront that central piece of identity, and they'll certainly never confront the meaning. So most of the change that people are making is at best semi-permanent. And that's why the people who come to me are usually people who have got like concrete identities. Like they're billionaires, they're powerful people, they're running massive companies. Everything's based in their identity. But they can feel underneath that something's not right. But they don't know if they can trust the world by saying, this is just an identity. If I let this out, I'm done. And I become this safe place they can do that, unpack it, and become more powerful, not less.
So in that case, this is great. Because I talk about this all the time. We live out of reactively from our programming more than we actually do things. Our intuition is usually built off of reacting to our emotional source code from our programming more than anything else, right? To use your words. The person who says that their identity, I love this term because it has so many different meanings to different people. Mm-hmm. And the way you just explained it to me, if I were to go and ask 10 people on the street, hey, how would you describe your identity? I would get vastly different definitions of what they would think identity meant to them, right? Mm-hmm. So what do we mean by identity? Because I hear you saying one thing is where there's a core unconscious identity that many of us have never tapped into. And then there's this manifestation of the outward identity that we've tried to create based on our programming.
So first of all, understanding that identity is not chosen. It's a reaction to the meaning of survival, right? So if I ask you what your identity is, most people will tell me their career.
Right.
Right. Or I'm a Christian. They might tell me their religion. Right. But your identity is not a single thing. It's a composite of many things that come together. So yes, you might be a Christian or a Jew or a Muslim or whatever it is you might be, but that's not your whole identity. That's a facet of your identity. And the way to understand it is this. I want you to think of, as you're watching this, as you're listening to this right now, what I want you to do is just for a moment, think about yourself in this way. Think about yourself looking back at who you were, who you've been, and has it had an evolution? Right? So people talk about passion. And I say, well, passion is a waste of time. Why? Well, think about your passion when you were 15. If I was doing what was my passion, I'd be a manager of Victoria's Secret. Because, pretty women in lingerie would have been my passion at 15, right? It's not a purpose. It's not what's driving me. It transitions, and it's the same thing with the identity, right? Different facets show up. But when that identity comes out of the meaning, and the meaning is this: in order to survive in this environment, I have to be. Now, the interesting thing about that is That identity now is being based on what I have to be to survive. But it also means I have to decide what I can't be. So, for instance, I said I grew up around crime and violence, addiction, abuse. So if you objectively, Jeff, were looking at that kid, what would you say there's no space to be? What would you say about that kid's characteristic? Like, what would you imagine a kid who grows up in that environment can't be? The answer would probably be soft, gentle,
Right.
loving.
Yeah, they're going to mirror their environment, right?
All right. So it's like, how do I survive this environment? So my identity became tough.
Yep.
To survive. Meanwhile, I'm spiritual, I'm kind, I'm loving, I'm a poet, I'm an artist, I'm all those things too. But I have to disenfranchise parts of myself. And this is how we start understanding the identity. What did I have to disenfranchise? What did I have to push away in order to survive the environment? So when you're looking at your identity, that's a very important part. What did you have to remove or push away or disenfranchise in order to survive? And what have I pushed away that might not be bad? Because what you disenfranchised is not all bad, and what you kept is not all good. Some of what you kept is great. It's made you successful or whatever it is. But a lot of it's kind of shitty. And you do things to support the identity of being, well, I'm seen as successful, so therefore I will do this behavior that's actually incongruent with who I am within the disenfranchised part of me that is soulful.
Would you say that, and this goes beyond psychotherapy and even counseling, right? This is some deep soul search work that most humans never do. So therefore they walk around with this mystique of an identity in a new environment that they realize that they're now in a new environment. So they've evolved into this new identity to do what they needed to do to survive their new environment. And they've never really sat and unpacked all the different pieces of what they had to disenfranchise or not from all the different environments they've been in. So that therefore they keep repeating a lot of the same cycle of behavior that isn't serving them well.
You're absolutely right. And this is, I mean, you said something that's profoundly true and deeply saddening to me. And that is that most people will never do that work. Like, I work with a select number of clients a year who can, first of all, afford me. But aside from that, I have a qualification process. And you go, may I give you a quick story on that?
Yeah, please.
All right. So one of my clients said, this guy's having some problems and he wants, I want to introduce you. Is that okay? Yes. Okay. So I meet with this guy and he is paid for the first hour to meet with me to see if there's somewhere to go. Right. And at about 35 minutes in, I said, we're done. He goes, what do you mean? I said, we're done. He goes, I paid for an hour. It's only been 35 minutes. I go, I know, but there's no point. And he goes, what do you mean? I said, you can't afford me. And he's like, what? Do you know how much money I have? And I said, actually, I do. I said, I'm guessing, but let's see how good I am. And he goes, okay. I said, if you're not a billionaire, you're pretty damn close. And he goes, okay. I said, you live in West Vancouver, which is the most expensive property in Canada. And he goes, yes. I said, you live on the side of the mountain. And although you have a great view of an upper view of the city, you have to drive down into your driveway to get to the house. And he's like, is this like, he's getting creeped out. I said, what's more is when you go into your living room, it looks like a pristine showroom. It's beautiful. It's magnificent. You've got very expensive painting on the wall that's an actual art piece and is worth a lot of money. I said, but if you go down one level, that's where your family live with you, and your furniture is kind of old and tattered, maybe even secondhand. I said, you either drive the top of the line Mercedes or a Maybach. And he's like, how do you know all this? I said, because you know the price of everything and the value of nothing. You can't afford me.
How did he respond to that?
He pissed off. Like somebody said, did he change his mind? No, he didn't, because he was too embedded in his ego and in his identity, because everything I've just described, I knew was the identity that he was holding on to. He didn't want to let that go. What he wanted from me was to polish his identity. Like I always say, if Humpty Dumpty falls off the wall, your job is not to get the sellotape and the glue out and try and put him back together. The idea is to make scrambled eggs. Find out what's coming out of that. It's not about putting things back together. The greatest gift you will ever have will feel like the greatest curse you'll ever have, and that's called an identity crisis. I know because I'm Humpty Dumpty. I fell literally off the mountain, 120 feet, that's about 12 stories, and landed on my coconut. Got smashed to pieces. And when people would ask me, how are you doing while I was in recovery, I'd go, I'm great, I'm coming back. I was a bloody liar. I wasn't great, I wasn't coming back. But my identity was so threatened by that question that people say, it must have changed you. It didn't change me. It embedded me in my ego. It made me worse than ever. I'm a ghetto kid. I've boxed, I've martial arts, I've been a bodybuilder. Yeah, I've had businesses on 3 continents. You can't keep me down. That was the ego.
Yeah.
And it wasn't until 9 months later, a gestation period, that I fell into a deep, dark depression and had to confront, this is not who I am. I can't put Humpty Dumpty together again. So what is at the truth? What's at the core? What is my purpose? What is my soul crying for me to serve in the world? And it's from there that I've been able to bring what it is that I do. Even though I built the thesis for emotional source code many years before, I'd not fully integrated it in myself. And that's the transformation.
That's amazing. So how old were you when you fell off the mountain?
32.
So 32 years old, you fall
So
literally
it was 2
off
years
the
ago.
mountain. Hey, you're looking great. You drop 120 feet. You land on your. I think didn't you break every bone in your face?
Yeah, every bone in my face was smashed to pieces. My jaw was in 5 separate pieces. Both cheekbones were flattened. Nose was gone, and the upper ridge of my eye was shattered and brought down. So when they put me back,
no one shoved you. No one shoved you, right? Because I mean, you.
No, I was free climbing.
Oh, you were.
I was an adrenaline junkie. I was free climbing.
Holy cow! And then the reality is it's a miracle you even survived, right? So, but your identity in the hospital and recovery was still tied back to that little boy in Northern England who had to be tough. And you'd built so much of your identity around overcomer, tough guy, you could endure anything, that you were trying to overcome the fall with the identity that you had lived your life with. And it wasn't until you got out of the hospital that you had your collapse emotionally. So you had your collapse physically. It wasn't until several months later that you had the collapse emotionally, where you really hit the bottom. You fell even further down the mountain, that you had the aha.
But that's my exact point, is that everybody thinks it's the event. Like, so, oh, you went bankrupt, it must have changed you. No, it didn't. I remember going to visit a friend of mine 10 years ago in the hospital who'd had a triple bypass. Totally unexpected, massive heart attack, triple bypass. Right? I'm in the hospital with him. I've known him for years. He works like a dog all the time. Lives in an identity of, I'm poor, and he has insane amounts of money. But that's his identity. So he works like a dog, and he's never present. I go see him in the hospital because I love him. He's a good guy. He's just got some really poor ideas. And so I said, how you doing? And he's like, you know what? I've learned my lesson. And I go, what? He goes, I realize how many of the kids' birthdays I've missed, anniversaries. I'm just not there for people. And he goes, I've changed. I realize this is a wake-up call. I go, Alan, I'm really happy to hear that. I've been telling you that for years. He goes, yeah, I know. And I didn't listen. You're absolutely right. I'm changing. I'm like, great. I saw him a couple more times in the hospital. He was equally convincing each time. I saw him 4 months later. He was working 60 hours a week.
Right back on the horse.
Right back. And I said, I thought you were changing. He goes, well, this is just who I am. Identity. This is just who I am. No, it's not. This is the identity you're choosing, and you're terrified to let that go, so you will miss more of your children's birthdays. You will miss more of the important events of your life in pursuit of grounding in this identity. It's not until so the event doesn't matter. The event is only there to wake you up from and wake you up to. Mine was there to wake me up from who I'd been, to wake me up to who I actually am. That's the same with any major event. Heart attack, divorce, bankruptcy, it doesn't matter. But what most of us do is we go, oh, well, I'll just double down on the identity. That's what I did. And it's a terrible idea. It's destructive.
But that's what you know, right? Your brain's self-preservation orientation will tell you that that's the best survival mechanism, is what you're most familiar with. And it's the biggest lie that we tell ourselves.
Change is a threat. You know this. You know this better than most, Jeff, with your understanding of the neuroscience. That part of our brain is incredibly threatened if we don't do what we've always done. Change is threatening. Please understand that. Change is threatening. The amygdala kicks in and goes, oh shit, it's different. Right?
Yeah.
And so we are living in a time right now that is all change. Right? I wrote a big article about this and talked about the cognitive overload that we're in politically in the world today. You know, Trump's first, and that time it was like 6 weeks. And I said, you know, he signed all these executive orders, and you may be finding that you're throwing your arms up in the air and going, I can't handle it anymore. I'm watching Netflix. That's not because there's something wrong with you. It's because you're in cognitive overload. That's what happens when we're in cognitive overload. It doesn't matter whether it's Donald Trump or 50 other things. Like we used to, you and I, well, you're a lot younger than me, but you are old enough to remember when you had to go look for news. If you wanted to know something, you turned on the news and you looked for the news. Now you're bombarded with the news 24/7. We're in cognitive overload. What that does is that takes us away from being able to be in the prefrontal cortex at the higher levels of thinking. When we're not in prefrontal cortex, we attach to the amygdala, and there we're in fear. So what are you going to hang on to? What is familiar? What's familiar? Your identity, your survival mechanisms. So people are more confronted with change now and more confronted with doing that work than ever and less likely to do it. That's what's fascinating, that we need it more and we're less likely to do it.
Yeah. And I tell you, you coach a lot of business leaders. The idea of change and change resistance. I mean, you and I are talking about, deep, heavy, purpose-driven, soul-crushing or soul-inspiring concepts around identity, which is critical because at the end of the day, what else really matters? But the everyday practicality of this is it happens in these little micro identities and change resistant moments every day. It seems like, and the more we're being bombarded with the programming, and when I say programming, to your point, the cognitive overload, you can say what you will, but it's programming.
Of course it is.
Like your brain is getting programmed repeatedly with millions of bits of information every day. And tell me if I'm wrong on this, I think your brain is interpreting it through the lens of your own beliefs of your identity based on the meaning you've already assigned to things. And it only further exacerbates how you feel. And then therefore you dig in even deeper to, well, the way I'm doing it has to be the way that I keep doing it, because now the programming is only reinforcing the beliefs. That's the confirmation biases, blah, 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 blah. And so I see a lot of myself, you catch yourself a lot, right? We do this work, but I still catch myself sometimes feeling like the master cobbler whose kids have no shoes, because you really have to stop every day and go, okay, am I doing that? Am I doing the work? What environment am I in today? What do I believe about my own identity in this environment? And am I being my best self to myself and to others based on what I believe about my identity in this environment today? And how many leaders aren't able to do that?
Well, this is the other thing is that, so we've got two kinds of, in the business world, we've got two kinds of leaders. We've got founders and CEOs. Those are different. So a founder is somebody who started the business based on some dream or some inspiration or whatever it might be. And a CEO is a hired gun. People forget that. You're the CEO of Microsoft. You're the CEO of Schwingle Schwongle XYZ company. But the truth of the matter is you're a hired gun. And as a hired gun, you have to keep those above you happy. If you're a founder, you don't have to do that, right? So there's a difference in mentality. But as a founder, you've also still got your own biases. That's different than having to answer up. You have a biases. So both of these things are determining what your outcome is. So if I'm a high-level CEO, I'm trying to keep the board happy. If I'm a founder, I'm actually validating my belief system, which may be very destructive. So you put it beautifully. I mean, that's exactly what it is. We have to stop. And so you know this, Jeff, because you've been on my show. I sign off everything I do. I will today with stay curious, my friends, stay curious. Why? Because I believe it's the cure for the world. When people ask me after all the religious studies I've had, what's your religion? My religion is curiosity. And because it's my faith, I fail at it miserably all the time. And I have to remind myself, be curious here, Dov. If you want to say this person's an idiot, be curious here, Dov. If you want to think this person's ideas are lost in space, be curious here, Dov. Because I'm going to, by my nature as a human being, fall into my biases. It's not a bad thing. It's just what we do. But we can overrun that by saying, well, okay, hold on a second. What don't I know here? What am I not seeing? What don't I understand? One of my clients for a long, long time, his executive assistant and him came in to work with me yesterday. She's been with him for 17 years. She's a pain in the ass. She's horrible for anybody to work with, but she's fantastic for him. She does everything he needs. But anybody who has to work under her is like, oh my God, she's a pain in the ass. And I start talking to her about having communication that's based on curiosity and kindness. She's only been trained to be curious about how to do it better, so she gets it right. She received no kindness in her childhood, so she has no model.
Yeah.
It doesn't make her a bad person. It's like I'm saying, please speak to me in Portuguese, and she's like, I've never learned Portuguese. So don't beat yourself up for that. You never learned it, but you can learn it step by step. Obrigado. Oh, thank you. All right, good. I got one word. Fantastic. Right? Whatever it takes. And this is when we're looking at other people, is understanding what is their frame of reference? Where did they come from? What is the language they grew up with? As opposed to judging people. If you grew up in the South in the 1940s, you were a racist.
It's your program.
If you weren't, you were a complete oddball, not because you were choosing to be a racist. It's because everybody who surrounded you saw black people or people of color as less than. Does that make you a racist? Only in expression, but not in truth. In truth, you may have not known anything else. Like I am Mandarin ignorant. Well, why? Because I've not been in China. I have been in China, but I've not been in China long enough to learn the language. Do I have 3, 4, 5, 10 words? I do. I have those in lots of languages, but it doesn't make me an expert because I wasn't around it enough. But if I move to Shanghai and I live there for 10 years, I'm going to learn the language. And it's going to seem odd that I didn't. It's exactly the same with a belief system. And a belief system is based on the identity, and the identity is based on the meaning in order to survive. That's it. So instead of me looking at you and going, you're an idiot, it's like, maybe you've had no exposure, or you've had exposure, but you're so deeply embedded and so fearful of not surviving if you take on anything new. I understand that.
I think this is such a great, not just theme, but concept that doesn't get talked about enough in all circles, especially in leadership circles. But your idea of tribalism and the concept that's rooted all the way back to survival, if you start to look at everything through the lens with curiosity, through the lens of survival, if I take everything back to the lens of survival, so if I'm not allowed to judge another human being unless I become curious enough to wonder why they are doing what they're doing, saying what they're saying, or behaving the way they're behaving, if I can't identify what their survival instinct is to cause them to be that or do that or say that, if I start looking at it through that lens and become curious to learn their story to find out why they believe that, it's always rooted back to survival, right? Which is why tribalism is the way it is. It's why everything we do as humans is rooted back to the brain's instinct to survive, which is how you open the show, basically.
You're absolutely right. And so think of it this way. Do you have kids, Jeff?
Yeah, I do.
Do you remember when they were born? Remember first time you held them? Of course you do. And you remember how overwhelmed you were with love, right? Of course.
Yeah.
That's oxytocin. That's a neurochemical called oxytocin that floods your brain. That very same neurochemical allows you to other. So there's a movie that came out, won an Oscar last year, that is a movie about an example that I have been giving for 30 years. And the example is this. A guy works at a concentration camp. He's a guard. He has to walk children into the gas chamber. And you go, what a psychopathic bastard. What a horrible, horrible human being. But that same guard goes home to his family and is a loving husband, plays with his kids, and is a loving father. So you go, well, is he a psychopath? Is that how does he compartmentalize as a psychopathy? No, it's oxytocin. Oxytocin allows us to love, but it also allows us to other. And when we can other, you are no longer human. You're no longer human. You're separate from, you're outside of my tribe. Therefore, you're a threat to my tribe. So I'm not treating you as a human. This is the danger of these very powerful, destructive individuals. They are constantly othering. We're seeing it with the liberals against the MAGA against people who are not MAGA. You know, it's like you're othering. It's dangerous. I've just written a big article about how Trump took over Canada. He's annexed Canada. And people are like, how can you say that? And I'm like, it's not literal. But we just had, and the reason I'm using it is because we just had an election, and the election was about Trump, no matter which side you were on. It was, can you stand up to Trump, or are you too much like Trump? Australia's got one coming up, got a national election coming up. It's the same thing. So he's taken over it because he's brilliant at othering. So now we've got Canadians othering other Canadians. This is part of the challenge, right? Othering is an incredibly powerful weapon of people who want to destroy the cohesion of who we are. And what we have to go to is the curiosity of how are we alike? How are we alike, Jeff? We seem so different. You're, I'm guessing 6'1"?
Yeah, good guess.
But good guess, right? I'm not. I'm 5'8", right? You're younger than me, right? We live in different countries. There's a lot of, we can go to all those things that seem so different. But there's also a million things that are so similar. You're into neuroscience. You coach. You're based in kindness, and you serve high-profile individuals. You know, there's a lot of things that you and I have in common. Why are we focused on what we have that's different? That's a survival mechanism. That's tribal, but it's not. It may be default, but we don't have to choose the default. You can go into Word and say, I don't want Times New Roman. I want something else. Okay. Now, do you have to do that all the time? Yeah, you kind of do. Isn't it exhausting? Absolutely, but it's less exhausting than constantly looking at everybody as my potential enemy.
And I think that's it. I mean, I think you nailed it. And we don't do that because of our programming. And we actually don't have good enough filters on our programming to recognize that our programming is designed to keep us in a state of othering. And if you don't recognize that consciously, then your unconscious will always, because of self-preservation orientation, it will force you. The irony to me with oxytocin is you talked about it as this idea of this, we call it the trust chemical, and how it allows us to be a good father and a husband and parent, all that kind of stuff. But then what happens if I immediately recognize a threat from someone in my out group? The exact opposite neurochemistry happens. Adrenaline triggers, cortisol spikes, and I go in to pick up the spear and defend things at all costs. And so this juxtaposition in my neurochemistry of I'm built for love and affection and kindness, because oxytocin and all the things that makes me want to be that kind of a person. But then my programming is activating all the opposite neurochemistry, putting me into a state of othering. And I stay in that state because I can't put my phone down. And my phone is the primary culprit today. And I think the manifestation of more othering than anything else we get. And so then what happens is I take all of that neurochemistry that's driven toward anxiety, self-preservation orientation, and it starts to infect my ability to actually turn around and be loving and kind. And it's harder for me to produce the oxytocin I need to be the person I really want to be. I think that's the state we're in today, and it's because of the programming that's happening all around us. But tell me if I'm crazy and way off the 120-foot ledge of a mountain.
No, you're not crazy enough the ledge. It's important to recognize, though, that it is the oxytocin that bonds us and creates the love and the trust, but it is oxytocin that triggers othering. It's actually the same chemical that then triggers the dopamine, the adrenaline, and all.
Well, because I recognize the contrast, right? But I can't stay in a state of self-preservation.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It's the contrast. But it's because it's so deeply set all this, it recognizes, it's the oxytocin that recognizes this as a potential threat and then fires off the adrenaline and all the other stuff that's not good. You're absolutely right on that. Now, the thing about it is to understand that that will take a commitment.
That's it.
For me to remain in a state, and that state is to choose not to other. And so again, the only action, so like you said, the phone is telling us constantly the other, the enemy, blah, blah, blah. The algorithms are designed for that. But if you move to a state of curiosity, so here's the thing, right? We're very tribal. We talked about that. I have a course, it's called Creating Cultures of Belonging. I got a new book that'll be out this year on exactly the same thing, cultures of belonging. Because corporately, we worked very well with this idea of othering. And how was that done? It was called, we're going to build a corporate culture where people fit in. And if you don't fit in, out you go. Get the right people on the right bus in the right seat. Good idea until COVID. Doesn't work anymore. It's a disaster. It's caused all kinds of problems. What people want now is not where to fit in, but where to belong. Belonging means I can show up in a red hat and a dress, a MAGA hat and a dress as a bloke and still go, okay, I don't care what you show up as. I share about who you are, how you come to work, how you present as in at an emotional and relational level, and the values and skills you can bring to this. Places of belonging. We need to look at how is this a fit at a level of belonging? How are we so different yet so much the same? I think you know the story of Tony and I. Tony, who was a neo-Nazi, who came to me back in the day, sat down in front of me. I didn't know he was a neo-Nazi. And I said, Damien's paid for you. You've been here 15 minutes of the hour. I'm too expensive to waste the time. We've had a lot of laughs, but why are you here? He looks at the rug and he's like swallowing golf balls and says, I'm a neo-Nazi, right? And he starts telling me about some of the beliefs he has, blah, blah, blah. And he's looking down because, and I said, why, that's a look of shame. What's later on? I said that. And he said, well, because every time I've mentioned that, I've lost everybody. Lost my friends, lost business, blah, blah, blah. So he's looking down at the rug and he finally lifts his head and looks up at me. And I've got this big, stupid smile on my face while he's telling me I'm a neo-Nazi. And he goes, what the fuck are you laughing at? Like, he's mad.
Yeah.
I go, you do know I'm a Jew, right? And he's like, what? I go, yeah, by birth, I'm Jewish. My name is a very Jewish name. And he's like, oh, fucking irony of ironies. And I go, absolutely. Now, we spoke at the UN together, and the person who was interviewing us said to me, how could you help somebody who was so different to you, who was sort of cheering for the annihilation of your people? And I said, because you're talking about a neo-Nazi. I wasn't talking to a neo-Nazi. She said, he told you he was a neo-Nazi. I said, no. What he was an articulate, intelligent young man who needed a place to belong. I was one of those too. She goes, you were a neo-Nazi? I go, no. I was intelligent, articulate, needed a place to belong. I just didn't find the group he found. But that group put their arms around him and said, we'll take you in. We'll hold you up. And as a result, that's what he became. That's not who he is. That's a survival mechanism that built an identity that looked like a neo-Nazi, but that's not who he is. And he and I are very good friends, and he speaks in synagogues now and wrote a wonderful book called The Cure for Hate, and, does amazing work around the world in getting people away from radicalization, because he understands that what we need is to belong.
Yeah.
And then when we start to go belong, we're no longer inside of those lines of, well, you're white, I'm not. You're this race, faith, I'm not. You're this political party, I'm not. We're looking at, what have we got in common? Let's find out. This is going to be exciting. We seem so different. Let's find out.
Boy, that's a great way to end right there. If we could just adopt that mindset in all of our relationships and be more curious like that. It takes so much discipline and willingness, though, to bypass all of your amygdala programming of fear, of survival, but it's doable, and you're doing your life's work is helping.
It's a muscle, Jeff. It's a muscle.
It is, right, and you gotta flex it.
Doing squats that you've never squatted before, you lucky if you can hold the bar on your back. But keep going, 3-4 years, you'll be squatting a couple of 100 pounds. It'll be fantastic. But the idea that you could squat 200 pounds when you've never squatted is like, that's ridiculous. I could
Seems
never
impossible,
do that.
right?
Seems impossible. It's exactly the same with this. So you just got to work that muscle, and you can, but start small. Start small. Like start with your partner, the person you love in your life. Like most marriages break down, not because of all the reasons we think, but because we've stopped being curious. We assume we know this person. Like, here's a question for you. If you're watching this, just so you can get it, go home tonight and say to your partner, you've known me for whatever the amount of years is. What's the one piece of damage you know from my childhood that you wish you could take away? And then ask the question in reverse. Let them ask you.
Wow.
And suddenly you go, oh my God, I don't know my wife.
Yeah.
We've been married for 142 years. Wow.
That's great.
Say to your kids, if I could go back in time and change one thing about how I was as a parent, what would you have it be? Oh my God, I don't know my children.
Yeah, that's big. Well, where can we get more of these resources, Dov? Where can everybody go learn more about you? I know most people can't afford you, but those who can are going to reach out. But those who can't, you have other resources that they can access.
Yeah, I mean, I have so many free resources, and people can afford me better than they think they can. So you can find, of course, my main website is dovbaron.com, dovbaron.com. You find out everything about me there. You'll find my podcast there, The Dov Baron Show, which look for it. Jeff is on there, and it was a fantastic show. You were an amazing guest. I really appreciate you. I mean, what you had to say was important and powerful, and I really want to encourage you as a listener, if you've not heard that episode, go back and listen. So that's on there too. I write on Curious Chronicles, which is on there, which I write these articles that I discussed here. I also write for LinkedIn. You can contact me through LinkedIn. I write once a week on there every Tuesday. I have a YouTube channel under my name as well. There's about 1,500 videos on there. I mean, basically, if you put Dov Baron into Google, you're going to get more than you actually want.
Right.
I mean, like 6 of this guy. There's lots of material there.
We just scratched the surface of all the things that we could have talked about today. And so that's why I want people to go on to dovbaron.com, dovbaron.com, and really dive deep into your stuff, because you've done a lot of research in so many different areas and then distilled it into some really easy and palatable ways to understand. We might have talked over some people's heads today, but I think for the most part, people get this. They feel it deep. They feel it deep in the soul, and they know that the stuff we talked about is truth. And now it's a challenge, right? We're throwing the gauntlet out to see if people can start to lean into some of these concepts.
Yeah, because it's not enough to know. We've got to do. And before I finish, I want to say 2 things, if that's okay.
Please bring us home.
First is this, is that if you want to reach out to me, I know it's crazy, but you can write to me directly, Dov@DovBaron. That's my private email address. I do answer all comments. So if you want to write to me, tell me what you got out of this episode and what you're going to do with it, that would be great. Moreover, I want to say to you this. I know what it takes to put a show together because I've had a show for 15 years. Jeff and his team put this together. They bring in these amazing guests for you so that you get all of this guidance and help at no charge to you. All of us who come on and are a part of Jeff's guests, we're all high ticket individuals. You're getting this because of Jeff's outreach, because of his team's outreach. And so what I want you to do is I want you to go onto the show, subscribe to the show, to this podcast, rate and review this, and share it with others. Not necessarily the episode with me, because you might not like that. You might like those other episodes. But share it with others, because that is important. This is not a one-way street. Get into reciprocity of generosity. Share it with others. Get it out there in the world. Because your 1 minute of any episode might be the moment that changes people's lives. And the only way you can do that is to get out of your own fixed mindset and think about how you can help others, how you can serve others. And the only way you do that is to stay curious, my friends. Stay curious.
Amen. Appreciate, brother. Appreciate, brother Dov. I love it. Thank you for the shout out. You've been an amazing guest. Can't wait to stay in touch and do this again on both sides of this as we continue to learn more and grow more and help more people.
Thank you, sir. It was a pleasure and an honor.